I have in fact done a bit more digging and played the first few opening hours of Symphony of the Night. I was curious to see what elements in Vampire Survivors are influenced or inspired by the Castlevania franchise. In Symphony of the Night alone, the evidence is almost immediate. The most prominent comparison for me would probably be the extinguishable light sources such as the many braziers, candles, and candelabra, and not ignoring breakable ornamentations like vases and statues, etc. From these destroyed decorations, we have the occasional pieces of loot to collect in the form of modest bags of dosh or single coins of currency, not forgetting the turkey dinners to keep our survivors well fed and on the mend. Other quick comparisons straight out the gate can be seen in the prelude where we control Richter Belmont. Like Vampire Survivors, we have use of the cross as a weapon, seen here acting like a blessed boomerang. And shortly after is the holy water or sacred water, known as Santa water in the Vampire Survivors game. I'm under the impression that in this case Santa is Spanish for saint, making it saint water. In the prelude, each sub-weapon has an alternative powerful attack. As an aside, I'm aware that combining or evolving weapons plays a part in some of the Castlevania titles, which again is featured in Vampire Survivors in the form of evolutions and unions. Once we leave Belmont and start to pilot Alucard proper, we get to see other examples of sub-weapons and passive items that appear in Vampire Survivors, such as the oh-so-handy axe, which uses a similar arc attack, great for hitting multiple opponents. The cousin of the Rune Tracer is known as the Rebound Stone or the Ricochet Rock. The equivalent of the King Bible or the King James Bible is succinctly titled as Bible or Holy Book. The Orologian pickup is a sub-weapon onto itself known as the Stopwatch. This can be a great tool early game because it allows us to cheese our way through some of the early boss fights if you stumble upon any. It's pretty cheap, dirty and effective. Another component we should not overlook is the inclusion of Death himself. This is matched by Vampire Survivors' use of various Grim Reapers, and even going as far as having an unlockable player character. Regardless of any creative differences across both games, what these Reapers have in common is their desire to ruin your fun by resetting your character's progress. This can be seen here when Death shows up to mug Alucard barefaced. The key detail I was interested in checking out for this video is whether there was a library in Symphony of the Nights, and does it contain any enemies that are similar to those encountered in the inlaid library. So far I've found 2 easy to identify creatures that appear in both library zones across both games. So I'm going to completely butcher this, but in Vampire Survivors I believe it's called Testa Demono, and that's the skeleton dudes who are holding their own heads and maybe have like a rapier in one hand. The equivalent of this in Symphony of the Night is called Duron. These guys also occupy the library and seem to exhibit a kind of fencing stance and attack, but fortunately, being a pretty early game enemy, they're not very hard to dispatch at all. The next creature would be the unliving snot globules. That is the Musk, and the Symphony of the Night version is the ectoplasm. The standout quality of the ectoplasms from Symphony of the Night is their ability to curse you, which prevents you from being able to attack unless you have an item to reverse said curse. Fortunately, they're not too hard to avoid so far. Another prominent entity represented in both games is the giant skulls. In Vampire Survivors, they whiz around the inlaid library like ghostly projectiles. I have been unable to locate any in the long library of Symphony of the Night. Instead, I have discovered them elsewhere in the map. In Vampire Survivors, I believe it's titled Skull One. In Symphony of the Night, it takes 2 forms. There's the much smaller Phantom Skulls, as well as the giant Skull Lords. Fortunately, they're both easy to dispatch. And finally, what I found to be an interesting comparison between the 2 libraries is that in Symphony of the Night's long library, you have the opportunity to pick up the Ferry Scroll, which allows you to identify enemies' names. It basically just puts them up on the UI on the screen, as you can see there. Before then, their names don't actually appear, which meant I had to go back and go fight some more enemies again, just so I can get their name to appear on the screen. In contrast, the Vampire Survivors inlaid library gives you the opportunity to pick up the Grim Grimoire, which unlocks the grimoire found in your pause menu, which allows you to view the possible evolutions and unions of weapons and passive items. The only other item that I would compare to Symphony of the Night's Ferry Scroll in terms of identifying enemies would be Vampire Survivors Bestiary, but you unlock that from the Ars Gouda found in the dairy plant, as opposed to the library stage.